Maseches Nedarim begins the topic of restrictions and obligations which a person can apply to himself, which are not listed in the Torah. There are many mitzvahs and obligations and restrictions that are in the Torah itself, and then there are some that a person can create on his own, and the Torah gives him the ability and the leeway to create those restrictions or obligations, and they have the full force of a Torah mitzvah, and if one violates them, he is violating an Isur Deraisa and a Mitzvahs Aseh. Now, there are many such types of obligations that can be created. There are shavuos, there are nazir, there are vows of obligations of tzedakah or hektish, and nedarim and charamim. Let's discuss briefly what these are. Our Masechta will obviously focus on nedarim. So you have shvuos. A shvua is when one swears to do or not to do something that is something which applies to him as a person, and therefore it doesn't matter what it's in reference to. It could even be in reference to something which does not exist. It's applying to himself. He's swearing he will do something or he will not do something. That creates an obligation or a restriction. This could also apply to give money to charity or things like that. Now, Nazirus is when he becomes a Nazir. That's discussed in Maseches Nazir. Shavuos are discussed in Maseches Shavuos. You also have vows to give tzedakah, which we mentioned. Then there are Nedarim and Charamim. Nedarim and Charamim are very similar things. Nedarim and Charamim both apply to an object itself, not to a person, but to the object, and therefore you can only make a neder on a certain object. What they do is they make a certain object usually forbidden. You could also make an object hektish, but that's not the focus of our Masechta, that's in Seder Kachim. But making a object forbidden to someone, creating an Isser, such as, so let's say a regular innocuous apple becomes forbidden to somebody as if it was a piece of pork. These things are isurim that are created by nedarim, and again, it only applies to the actual object itself. Now, in order to create a neder, and the same applies to charamim, in order to create nedarim, you have to have two things. You have to have the person's intent to create the neder, and you also have to have a verbalization of his intent. He has to actually speak out what the neder is. And very often, the neder will be restricted by his words and what they mean. And there's a large percentage of the Masechta is spent on what the different verbalizations mean, different verbiage, what do they mean? Generally, we go with that it means what people intend them to mean, what the general usage in the vernacular is. And the Masechta will begin with this discussion as well. Now, there are two types of subsets to clearly expressing the neder. One can clearly say the neder, this apple is forbidden to me. That is a clear and a full expression of the neder. There are also other, what we call kinuyim, which are other terms that can be used for making the neder. So first of all, you could say that something is a carbon to you. That's not a kinui. A carbon is saying that this thing is forbidden to you as a carbon is forbidden to you. That would only apply if you use something like a carbon. You couldn't say it's a pig to me, but you could say it's a carbon to me. And then there are other terms which are similar to carbon or similar to other terms that are not necessarily terms we're familiar with, but they're similar terms. Those are called kinuyim. Then you have what are called yados. Yados is where you don't fully express the neder. You only say part of the neder, but there's enough said that the rest of the intent can be inferred, and therefore that counts as a valid neder as well. So our Mishnah, in the beginning of the first parak of Masechta Nedarim, discusses examples of kinuyim and yados, and it discusses that all kinuyim work and that all yados work, as long as they are clear. So let's begin the Mishnah. So the Mishnah refers to four types of obligations or restrictions that a person creates upon himself: nedarim, charamim, shavuos, and nazirus. And the Mishnah says that all types of kinuyim, all types of expressing these concepts with words that aren't necessarily specific words, they aren't words that we're familiar with, those all work. So for example, one can say carbon, a lie. One can say that a certain apple is a carbon to him. That would be the classic way of saying it. Or you could say that it's asar a lie. A kinoi would be to say something similar to carbon. So he could say konum, konas, or some other such word which is similar. The Gemara will discuss later on in the Masechta how these terms work and what they are familiar with. Now, on a cherim, you could say cherim z'alai. Cherim generally means that it's set apart from you. So that is a valid expression of saying a neder, or actually we call it a cherim. It's a different type of restriction. You can also have words that are similar to chayrim, such as chayrek, chayrech, and chayref. Those are all kinuyim for haramim. Now, then you have shvuos. Shvua could also be called a shvusa. That's a kinoi for a shvua. And Naziros, the Gemara will talk about, if the classic way to say it would be Nazirus alai. You could also say Nazik alai. Now, the Mishnah does not give these examples. The Rishonim give these examples. The Mishnah just says that there are kinuyim. Then the Mishnah goes on to talk about yados, which are brief, partial statements. Here the Mishnah gives examples. The Mishnah actually doesn't mention the halacha of yados. It skips it and just goes straight to the examples. So if somebody says, Mudrani mimcha, I am sworn off from you, there's a neder from you, that he means to say that I am separated from you and I cannot get any hana from your things. Or if he says, Mufrashani mimcha, I am separated from you, Murachkani mimcha, I am distanced from you. Those are all partial statements. He just said, I'm distanced from you. He didn't say, it is forbidden for me to have any hana from you because I am at a distance, but that's a partial statement. Or he could also say, Sha'ani ochalacha, that I eat from you, which means to say that it's forbidden for me to eat from you. Or he says, Sha'ani tamam lacha, or that I taste from your possessions. All these things count as a yad, and they are valid. Even though they're partial expressions, it's clear what he means. Now, we should mention at this point that a neder works to make someone else's, all his possessions at once forbidden to you. You can also make all your possessions forbidden to someone else. Cannot make two other people's possessions forbidden to each other, or one's possessions forbidden to himself. Anything that has to do with you, either others' possessions on you or your possessions on others, you can make a neder on all of them at once. Now, the Mishnah ends off with one case which is somewhat unclear. It says menuda ani lecha. Menuda generally means wandering, or could even mean a cherem. There, it's not clear if that's meant to be interpreted, if that's clear that it should be interpreted as creating a neder or a cherem. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva, the Mishnah says, was not sure of the psak, and he was machmir. He ruled stringently. So this is the Mishnah. Now the Gemara begins, and the Gemara is going to have some linguistic issues on the Mishnah before we actually get to the content of the Mishnah. And these linguistic issues will take us through the rest of the daf and into the next daf. So the Gemara first of all wants to know, how come over here we list Nedarim, Charomim, Shavuos, and Naziros, that Kinei works for all of them, but in Maseches Nazir we start the same way, and we say that Kinei works for Nazir, and we don't say that Kinuyim work for all four. Why did we leave out the other ones? Here we mentioned all four types of restrictions and said Kinei works for all of them, but in Nazir, in Maseches Nazir, we only mentioned Nazir and didn't mention any of the other types of restrictions that a Kinei works for them as well. So the Gemara answers, because neder and shvua, we wanted to mention the two of them together, and that's because in the pasuk that describes a neder discusses neder and shvua together. It says kol neder v'chol shvuas iser lanos navish. Therefore, we want to put the two of them together, so we say neder and shvua. Once we're saying two, then we're going to list all four. However, in Maseches Nazir, where Nazir is not listed together with anything else, we're not going to list anything other than the Nazir itself. Asks the Gemara, if that's the case, so then right after you mention Nedarim, it should say Shavuos right away. Why does it say Nedarim, then Charamim, and only then Shavuos? So the Gemara explains, because Nedarim and Charamim are similar in that they are both an Isser on the object itself, while Shavuos are an Isser, or an obligation that applies to the person. And therefore we put Nedarim and Charamim together, and only then do we go to Shavuos, which are a vastly different category of restriction. All right, now the Gemara goes to its next linguistic issue on the Mishnah, and that is, why does the Mishnah not mention examples of kinuyim? And why does it not mention the heading about yados at all? It mentions that all kinuyim work, and then it starts giving examples of yados. It doesn't mention examples of kinuyim until daf yud, and it does not introduce yados at all. So the Gemara says, well, as far as the fact that it's not introducing yados at all, that's not a problem. That's what we call chasuri mechzera the hachi kitani. That's that it meant to say all types of kinuyim count, and all types of yados count, and yados of nedarim are like nedarim themselves. Now, why don't we give examples of it? So the Gemara says that the reason is Because whenever you list two things, you start explaining the latter one first. And we're going to show you three examples throughout Shas where we list two things and we explain the last one first. So as far as the different types of oils, wicks, and candles that you can use for Shabbos, so we say Bameh Madlikin or Bameh Ein Madlikin. What can you use and what can you not use? And right away we start explaining what you cannot use. As far as what you can use to wrap a patzah that stays warm, we say Bameh Tomnim or Bameh Ein Tomnim. And right away we start explaining what we cannot use, Ein Tomnim. As far as what a woman's allowed to wear in the street that's carrying, we say Bameh Isha Yotze, Bameh Eina Isha Yotze. And again, we start explaining Lo Seitzeh Isha, what she's not allowed to wear. So you see, all these examples, we start explaining the latter thing on the list first. So says, well, that's not true, because I'll show you 5 examples where you explain the first thing on the list first. So, for example, as far as who inherits, so we have a list of people that inherit. So we say Yesh Nochlin Umanchilin. There are those that inherit to certain relatives and bequeath to them as well. And then we have that there are those that are Nochlin Velo Manchilin, those that inherit but do not bequeath. And then when we start explaining it, we begin with Ve'ilu Nochlin Umanchilin. We begin with the first thing on the list. Second example, we have Yesh Mutaros Lebalein Basuros Liyibmeyan. There are those that are women who are permitted to their husbands and forbidden to their Yevamos. And then there are those that are permitted to their Yevamos and are forbidden to the husbands. We start explaining it. We do the first one. These are the ones that are permitted to their husbands and they are forbidden to their Yevamos. Next example, third example, we have certain Karbonos Mincha require oil and Lavona spice, and certain require oil but not Lavona spice. And when we begin listing it, we first list those which require oil and Lavona spice, the first thing on the list. For example, we have certain karbanos which require hagasha and tenufa, being brought on the mizbech and being waved, and certain ones which require being waved and do not require being brought on the mizbech. And when we start listing first the ones which require both hagasha and the tenufa being brought and being waved. A fifth and final example is when we teach the halachos of what is a bechar. So bechar could be first born as far as the inheritance, that is, he receives a double portion of the inheritance, and also the second halacha that he requires pidin haben, he has to be redeemed from a kohen. So we have a list where we see there are some that are considered to be a firstborn as far as inheritance, but not as far as pidin haben, and there are those that are considered to be firstborn as far as pidin haben, but not as far as inheritance. And when we begin listing it, we say these are the ones that are considered to be firstborn as far as inheritance, and not pidin haben, the first thing on the list. So here you have 5 examples where you list the first thing on the list. So it's not true what you said that you always list the last thing. You explain the last thing on the list first. So the Gemara is going to try to offer a number of examples, a number of reasons as to why there would be differences between the lists. So the Gemara first wants to say, anytime you have only 2 items on the list, you start with the latter one. Anytime you have more than 2, you start with the earlier one. All those examples which you brought, you had 4 on each list, and therefore we start with the earlier one. It would be too confusing to start with the latter one and work backwards. So Gemara says, okay, you want to say that 2, you're always going to start with the latter one. It's not true. I'll show you another example where there's only 2 items on the list, and you start with the earlier one. What's that? What is an animal allowed to carry on Shabbos? So we say, Bameh behema yotze. What is an animal allowed to go out with? Bameh eina yotze. What is it not allowed to go out with? There are only 2 items on the list, and we start explaining what an animal is allowed to go out with. We say yotze hagamo. A camel is allowed to go out wearing the following things. So the Gemara just says, okay, so it can go either way. There's no rule. Sometimes you go one way, sometimes you start explaining the latter, sometimes you start explaining the former. Now, the Gemara is going to give more answers. We'll see those on the next daf Gimel, Mir Hashem.